Today we are talking about quite possibly the least reliable car that we've talked about on this channel to date, and that is the Mazda RX-8. So I owned a Mazda RX-8 for about 8 years, and I can tell you they are really fun cars to drive. There's nothing quite like having a 9,000 RPM. They do lack a little bit of power, but they handle extremely well. If you put a little bit of money into suspension upgrades, they're extremely fun cars to drive, and they're quick around the corners and quick on a track, despite not being very fast in a straight line. However, when it comes to reliability, they have a terrible track record for reliability. Most RX-8s and their 13B engines do not make it to 100,000 miles without needing a rebuild or needing a new motor. And the ones that do make it past the 100,000 mile mark are really just living on borrowed time. It's very rare to see anything make it to 125,000 miles. If you do, you probably have somewhat low compression, or you're due for running into a major catastrophic issue in the near future. But I fortunately had good luck with the motor on mine. Granted, when I got rid of it, it only had 72,000 miles, but I ran into very few engine-related issues, but I ran into a ton of other problems with the car. I blew through about 3 slave and master clutch cylinders. I blew through 2 catalytic converters. The spark plugs, ignition coils, and spark plug wires probably had to be changed 3 times throughout my 50,000 miles of ownership. And I ran into a ton of other odd, random little problems, like my door lock breaking, which was a very expensive thing to fix, believe it or not. But all this to say, the RX-8 suffers from one major catastrophic problem, but it also suffers from a ton of other small problems. And so it's not great for overall long-term longevity, but it's also not great for general maintenance, repairs, and ownership costs. I know that's a lot of negative things to have said. I loved my RX-8. It's just hard to call it a reliable car, but I'm gonna go ahead and spend a little bit of time in this video walking you through some of the most common problems with these engines, as well as why they don't usually make it beyond the 100,000 mile mark. The first major issue to talk about is the apex seals. The apex seals are really the killer of any 13B rotary engine. If you think about a rotor is shaped like a triangle, and then it spins around in an oval-shaped rotor housing. And so there's only 3 points of the triangle that actually contact the rotor housing, and at the end of each corner of the triangle is what's called an apex seal. And that's the only thing that makes contact with the actual rotor housing. And because the apex seal is metal, they have to be lubricated. So oil comes out of the apex seals to lubricate the inside of the rotor housing. And ultimately, the apex seals are what cause serious problems on these engines. They start to leak, and once they start to leak, you'll lose compression. You only lose a little bit in the beginning, but then over time, you'll slowly lose more and more compression until you ultimately have a low compression dead engine that is going to need a rebuild. There's also potential that the apex seals actually blow out of the rotors, and then the apex seals can get drug along the rotor housing, which will completely tear up the rotor housing, and you're going to need a complete engine rebuild, but at that point it's less expensive to just toss a new junkyard motor in it. So apex seals are the #1 killer. There are a couple different things that cause the apex seals to fail. First of all, it's just temperatures. They go through a lot of different heat cycles, being heated up and cooling down. So naturally, over time, the metal just wears down. A second potential thing is they are spring actuated. So the springs hold the pressure up against the housing. The springs can weaken over time, and as the springs weaken, they'll start to leak compression. A third thing is gonna be low engine oil. These cars consume a ton of oil, and so if you let it run low on oil for a while, that can starve the apex seals, which then is going to cause metal on metal issues. The fourth thing is these cars do suffer from pre-ignition sometimes, and pre-ignition can actually create a back pressure that will blast the apex seals out of the rotors. So when that happens, that's when you're in serious trouble versus just needing to replace the apex seals. Overall, apex seals are the #1 catastrophic problem with these cars, and they're the main reason that Any 13B RX-8 engine barely sees any life beyond 120,000 miles, if that. They do tend to cause problems around 80,000 miles. And so once you get past 80,000, that's when the likelihood of this problem becomes a lot more severe. So now that's it for our one major problem, but there are other couple inherent flaws with it that lead to a number of other problems with the engine and smaller maintenance related repairs. The first thing is going to be the ignition system. The RX-8 has a weak ignition system, but it's not necessarily due to the spark plugs, the ignition coils, or the spark plug wires. It's more so due to the fact that these things rev to 9,000 RPMs. At 9,000 RPMs, your spark plugs and your ignition coils are going through so many more cycles, and they're being used a lot more frequently than they would on a car that doesn't rev anywhere near that. So the ignition coils typically last about 30,000 miles. Those are going to be the weakest component, but the spark plugs and the spark plug wires don't last very long either. And so typically you're going to want to replace those every 30,000 miles too. The weak ignition system leads to a number of other problems. Another one being catalytic converter failure. Once the ignition components start failing, that causes extra fuel to be dumped into the combustion chamber, which then gets sent out through the exhaust system. That unburnt fuel then detonates in the exhaust, and it causes the catalytic converter to clog. And so the catalytic converters go bad frequently. I blew through 2 of them on mine. Fortunately, mine did not clog, but I completely hollowed out the catalytic converter. In addition to ignition system problems causing catalytic converter failure, it also causes frequent starter failure. So the starter on the RX-8 is relatively weak to begin with. These cars have a hard time starting up in cold weather. When you factor an already weak starter along with a car that tends to always have some type of ignition issue with it, the starter has to work a lot harder, which causes the starter to fail a lot more frequently than it would on any other vehicle. So those are the 2 things that the weak ignition system can cause. A couple other common problems to talk about here is engine flooding. Engine flooding takes place when you start your RX-8 and you turn it off too quickly after starting it. And the reason that this is a problem is the RX-8's cold start process causes a lot of fuel to be dumped into the combustion chamber. So when you turn your car off right after starting it, you've got a whole lot of unburnt fuel within the combustion chamber, and then there's too much fuel in there for the engine to be able to actually ignite any of the gasoline to cause it to turn over. And so when that happens, it's called flooding your engine. There's really not any major problems with this. It just makes it a little bit difficult to get your car started. You have to go through a deflooding process, which sometimes can be very easy and sometimes can be very difficult. But engine flooding is very common, especially for people that don't understand how to properly take care of, maintain, and drive an RX-8 on a daily basis. And then another thing going along with that is excessive oil consumption. These engines just naturally burn a lot of oil. You'll typically go through a quart of oil every 1,000 to 1,500 miles. It's completely normal. There's nothing wrong with the engines. They just use a lot of oil. Part of the reason that these cars don't last very long too is just people not keeping up with proper maintenance and not understanding that these cars need a lot of additional oil to be added. So you always need to be checking the oil levels and topping them up appropriately. And then not related to the engine, a couple of other problems that I certainly ran into a lot of was the clutch master cylinder and the slave cylinder for the manual transmission. Those things fail a lot. I went through 3 of them before I got rid of the car. And then the manual transmission synchros can fail as well, or they get torn up, which causes you to grind your gears when you're shifting. One of the best things to do to prevent running into this issue and then needing some transmission work is to add what's called a synchro saver to your manual transmission. So that's kind of it for all of the other smaller problems. Overall, like I mentioned early on, we've got a lot of problems that aren't catastrophic, but that can get expensive to fix, which makes this an expensive car to maintain. So we've got a car that's expensive to maintain that has a couple weaknesses. On the other hand, we've got one major problem that leads to catastrophic engine failure or the need for an engine rebuild, and that typically happens around the 100,000 mile mark. So when we combine the high cost of just general maintenance for this vehicle and general ownership, along with the fact that they don't make it much past 100,000 miles, we have a pretty bad recipe for reliability. I loved my RX-8. It was such a fun car. I want to get another one of these days and do a more serious build on it, but I can't sit here and tell you with a straight face that it was a reliable car. My apex seals were reliable, but nothing else on the car was reliable. If you're gonna buy one nowadays, you have to go into it understanding it's expensive and you've got a limited lifespan out of these engines. Anyways, guys, that covers it for my guide on RX-8 problems. Coming up soon is gonna be a guide on performance modifications for the RX-8. So if you wanna take your slow 1.3 liter and make it a little bit faster, check out that video as I talk through every single modification for the RX-8 and the power gains that you get from it. Please subscribe to the channel, click the like button, and stay tuned for the future Mazda RX-8 content.